So, what is spiritual direction? Well, at its essence, spiritual direction is a relationship between the director, a directee, and God, who's at the center of and in the space between the director and the directee in the midst of that conversation, which is seeking to pay attention to God's activity in the directee's life. So, direction isn't about a directee coming and getting all the answers from a director or doing what someone else tells them, but instead it's learning to discern for themselves what God is up to in their lives and the invitations and noticings that God is drawing their attention to, and then responding to those invitations. So, in direction, we're really just paying attention to God's activity and presence in the everyday details of the directee's life. The directee is seeking to discern for themselves how God is leading or where God is calling them to next. The director supports and encourages the directee as they follow God's leading and discern for themselves what God is doing. Directors understand that all of life is spiritual. So, what kind of topics come into direction? Everyday life, everything that's drawing the directee's attention, from frustrations to relationships to invitations to celebrations, but especially focusing on where God is at in the midst of all of that and how God is speaking in and through all of those things or directing in and through all of those things. So, even though we're going to be looking at many different aspects of life, the main focus and attention is going to be on spirituality, not necessarily problem solving or resolving issues, but meeting God in the midst of even unresolved issues. So the focus of direction is on the relationship between God and the directee. In direction, we're going to pay attention to how we interpret our experiences, thoughts, and feelings in association with our relationship with God. And we're also going to recognize that this relationship with God takes place within all of the details and all of the relationships that we have in life. We're going to notice as best we can and listen as best we can for God in our lives and our hearts, allowing our relationship with God to influence all of our thoughts, all of our relationships, and all of our activities. So, what's the director's role in all of this? Well, as a director, I'm going to be prayerfully attentive, listening as the directee shares and reflects what they sense is maybe missing or stirring, or what they're noticing in both their outer life and their inner life with God, because God shows up in both places. I'm going to point out themes that I hear as I connect stories together, possible connections that are underneath the stories, invitations that are possible, or even redirecting the directee when they get to a point where they're losing sight of where God is at in it, and bringing our attention back to God with us. So the director may suggest things like prayer practices that fit the directee's personality and circumstances. The directee can try those, or if they don't feel God is leading them to those things at that time, then they can set those on a shelf for another time, or maybe not at all. The important thing is that the director is following God's direction for their lives. The director is just simply coming alongside, noticing, sometimes suggesting. We're going to support discernment, reflection, conversation with God, paying attention to God's presence, and most importantly, growing and deepening intimacy with God. So the goal of direction is really to increase awareness of God's activity in the directee's life, to grow in our conversation with God, our engagement and an intimacy with God, to actively respond to God's invitations, whether in prayer, in thought, in our relationships, vocations, or actions that God is calling us toward. Ultimately, direction is about arriving at the end to which God is leading you. I love the way that spiritual direction is defined by Sue Pickering. She says, spiritual direction could be defined as taking place when one person, the director, prayerfully supports and encourages another person, the directee, to attend and respond to God. As a fellow pilgrim, the director accompanies the directee on this journey of faith. The real director is God, the Holy Spirit, who initiates and inspires the directee's deepening relationship with the Trinity, with his or her own self, with other people, and with the realities of life in the global village of the 21st century. Christian spiritual direction seeks to help directees dive deeper into prayer, and draw closer to God in everyday life. Discover God's care in the midst of difficulties. Become aware of the sacred within the ordinary events of life. To honestly share with God their feelings, doubts, and questions. To discern what God is inviting us toward in our lives and relationships. To become more like Christ and to experience the fruits of the Spirit. To move from a preoccupation with our sinfulness toward a graceful life of love and service. Another picture of spiritual direction is given by John Mabry, and he describes it this way. Along the way, the director and directee talk about nearly everything that happens in life: work, play, relationships, personal struggles. But always the question comes back to a central question. How is the divine wooing us, calling us into deeper and deeper intimacy? As we go deeper, more questions emerge. What is the divine up to in all of our daily ups and downs? How is the divine moving and nudging and forming us through both our triumphs and our defeats? How do we resist the divine call? How does the divine's desire for intimacy threaten us and push us beyond our comfort zones? What does this intimacy require of us? What is it calling us to? In what ways are we out of congruence with the deepest truth of our souls, with this divine calling? And how does this imprison us and limit us? How can we move into deep places of interior freedom that are transformative and healing and liberating, not only for us, but for the world? Those are big questions. And in spiritual direction, we're seeking both to answer those questions, but also to live with peace and in trust with God when we don't have the answers to those questions. That's what spiritual direction is about. My own definition of spiritual direction goes like this. Spiritual direction happens when a director is prayerfully present with a directee. Both seek to pay attention to the current interior movements within the directee's inner and outer life. In so doing, the directee discerns God's invitations toward divine intimacy, healing, growth, and action.